Larry Dossey is a person kind of to be at the beginning of this program, because as Paul Cummins just told you the kind of Gaian story of the Earth, Larry's got the story of the band of reality that's beyond this ordinary reality. And he is such a really first-class representative of all of that kind of realm, the psi realm that Craig was talking about before. I told you could read everybody's credits, but he was chief of staff of a hospital. He's an internal medicine physician and has written many books, has a huge following, deservedly so, and speaks about the relationship between the body and consciousness, my favorite kind of topic. So, my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Larry Dossey.
Thank you, dear. Thank you. I am really glad you're here. I'm really glad I'm here. Now, I want to tell you what I'm going to talk about by referring to the very best book review I've ever had in my life, which was given back in 1982 when my first book was published, a book called Space, Time, and Medicine. Someone asked my mother, after the book was out, "What do you think about Larry's new book?" And my mom, without any hesitation whatsoever, said, "Well, I can't understand a word of it. But if my boy wrote it, it's right." So I'm just going to talk to you about what's right today. Well, my field, as Suzanne generously mentioned, has been internal medicine for most of my adult life, but I've had a side interest also. And it has to do with the fact that I was born very early in life as an identical twin. And all of my life, my twin brother and I have had stuff going back and forth between us, which we just call twin stuff. And it has to do with things that are very difficult to describe. Shared thoughts and sensations and feelings, and sometimes physical symptoms, even while we are great distances apart. And to compound this twin thing, I happen to be married to a twin. This is my wife, Barbara. She is a fraternal twin, and she and her twin brother have had this stuff in spades going on in their life. So our household has been sort of a twin laboratory for a lot of weird stuff for as long as I can remember. Now, there is a huge literature about this which drives skeptics nuts. It's almost always neglected. It's not in the textbooks, but if you search it out, it's not difficult to find. One of the pioneers who really put this field on the map was the well-known psychiatrist from the University of Virginia who has written widely with respect to children who remember past lives. He had another interest, which was the shared distant kind of symptoms which are inexplicable conventionally. He called them telepathic impressions, but if you go looking in the literature, the term you will find is something called telesomatic events. If you want to have your mind blown about this stuff, this is the go-to book. It's Twin Telepathy by the British consciousness researcher Guy Playfair. Now, let me describe one of these things to you, because this really brings the mind-body connection and the brain and consciousness connection into real focus and illuminates the problems therein. First of all, we know that about 30% of identical twins have these sorts of distant, remote, non-local connections, and this is what they look like. This case was reported from the 1970s. It dealt with 4-year-old twin girls in northern Spain, Sylvia and Marta Landa. Well, Marta was taken by the father to the grandparents' house many miles away. Sylvia stayed home with her mom. Unfortunately, as the mother was ironing, Sylvia put her hand on a red-hot iron and erupted in a second-degree blister. And at the same time, miles and miles away at the grandparents' house, Marta erupted with the same sort of blister on the same hand, the same pattern, and in the same place on the palm. Go figure. Now, I began having another category of weird experiences the very first year I was in internal medicine practice. This took the form of precognitive dreams. For some reason, I began to dream about events that would play out in the lives of patients I would see the next day. I found this very unnerving. I realized immediately that if I began to talk about this publicly, this would not be the very best way to advance my career in medicine. But this stuff would not go away, largely because when the nurses who I worked with in the hospital found out that I had an interest in this, they began to shower me with their own experiences along these lines. And my patients began to report their experiences about precognitive dreams in which they would dream their diagnosis and sometimes the treatment, which when they came to me the next day would play out in their life. The last leg on that three-legged stool was when my colleagues began to share their experiences with me, and they would usually preface their story with something like this. You know, I've never told anybody this in my life. But you could tell that this had deep meaning for them, and they needed to express it and get it out. I'll never forget a lecture I gave at a Harvard Medical School conference for continuing medical education for internal medicine doctors, in which I was talking about these kinds of experiences and how common that I suspect they are in my profession. And during the Q&A session, a very earnest female internist stood up in the middle of this group, and she said, well, I want to confess my story. She said, I get numbers in my dreams. She said, I dream these specific laboratory values of my patients' lab tests before I even order the tests. And that was just a warm-up. And it went from there. I think this is one of the best-kept secrets in modern medicine. It also is one of the biggest problems in modern medicine because, as I've already implied, this stuff is not in the textbooks, and officially, these things just cannot happen. Now, it's interesting to look at the way these prohibitions are phrased. This is from Carl Sagan, the famous astronomer. The brain's workings, what we sometimes loosely refer to as the mind, are a consequence of the brain's anatomy and physiology and absolutely nothing more. This is the materialistic approach that dominates the conversation these days, as Greg Weiler is always ready to describe. It's not difficult to find these things. John Searle, one of the leading mind-body philosophers in the country at UC Berkeley, says this: consciousness can't spread over the universe like a thin veneer jam. There has to be a point where my consciousness ends and yours begins. Now, if you fool around in this area, you will understand immediately that these conversations and dialogues often get very overheated. And sometimes it's at a point where we just simply need to sit down, shut up, and take a deep breath and ask seriously some fundamental questions. Among them is, how in the world could a physical brain produce consciousness in the first place? This is not often done. But when serious people address this, they often come out with some things that make them look like a deserter to the skeptic's cause. This is such a comment from Steven Pinker, the well-known the experimental psychologist from Harvard University. He was once asked, how is it that consciousness is produced by the brain? And he said, beats the heck out of me. I have some prejudices, but I have no idea how to begin to look for a defensible answer. And neither does anybody else. So Stuart Kaufman, the theoretical biologist and complex systems theorist, says much the same thing. Professor Kaufman says, nobody has the faintest idea what consciousness is. I don't have any idea. nor does anybody else, including the philosophers of mind. I love these comments. I don't know why. It's just something good. Freeman Dyson, one of the most famous physicists of our time, says, "The origin of life is a total mystery, and so is the existence of human consciousness. We have no clear idea how the electrical discharges occurring in nerve cells in our brain are connected with our feelings and desires and actions." Jerry Fodor, one of the most prestigious mind-body philosophers at Rutgers, nobody has the slightest idea how anything material could be conscious. Nobody even knows what it would be like to have the slightest idea how anything material, such as the brain, could be conscious. So much for the philosophy of consciousness. This from one of the most prestigious mind-body philosophers in our country. Donald Hoffman, my favorite cognitive scientist at UC Irvine, sums it up. The scientific study of consciousness is in the embarrassing position of having no scientific theory of consciousness. Folks, this is where we are in this debate. And when you hear skeptics offer these arrogant and presumptuous comments that we figured it out and you people are wrong, it's all in the brain, you don't have to go there. And the conventional view of separateness, separation, individual brains and minds and whole people, the whole premise of separation among human beings, I want to contend is false. And this is one of those false stories that we have been dragooned into accepting as fact. And in fact, when we look at empirical observations, we see that minds are not separate, they're connected. So what does this evidence look like? Well, let's go down to the component of brains, which are neurons. If you take a bunch of human neurons and put them in a petri dish and put them in something called a Faraday cage, which is shielded optically and electromagnetically, and you do the same thing with another batch and put them over here way in another Faraday cage so that these things cannot possibly have any sort of physical communication with each other, and you stimulate one of them, one batch with a laser light, the other one changes instantly in the same way. This makes skeptics go crazy. This is not supposed to happen. But it does happen, and these studies have been replicated by the same group and with other groups as well. And if you want to look at the data, this is Dr. Rita Pizzi in Italy who pioneered this particular methodology. She says, our experimental data seem to suggest strongly that biological systems present non-local properties not explainable by classical models. So you can go to huge collections of neurons, not just a few neurons in petri dishes. Our favorite large connection of neurons is our own brain. And if you take people and wire them up with an EEG over here and send somebody a long way off, also wired up to have an electroencephalogram brainwave tracing made, and you stimulate one brain, if these people are emotionally close, the other individual's brain changes instantly in the same pattern. You can switch off from EEG to functional magnetic imaging, resonance imaging, and see the same simultaneous transitions go on. Here is a body of information not a lot of people know about. It's called social network connections. It shows not just unification between distant neurons or distant brains, but whole groups of people tend to be unified as well. This work came out of the investigations by Dr. James Fowler, who's a political scientist at UC San Diego, and also Nicholas Christakis, who is a doctor and social scientist at Harvard Medical School. This data has been published in the British Medical Journal and the New England Journal of Medicine, and this is what it looks like. Christakis says, happiness is contagious. Your happiness depends not just on your choices and actions, but also on the choices and actions of people you don't even know, who are 1, 2, and 3 degrees removed from you. Fowler says, if your friend's friend's friend becomes happy, that has a bigger impact on your being happy than if somebody put an extra $5,000 in your pocket. You want to try? Volunteer for that one. Christakis sums up, emotions have a collective existence. They're not just an individual phenomenon. And so how could this stuff work? I mean, whether you're a skeptic or a devotee and proponent, we all want to know how it works. Well, here's how it works, and I'm happy I'm here to reveal this to you because you can take this explanation to the bank. As Sir Arthur Eddington said in another context, something unknown is doing we don't know what. This has become my favorite go-to explanation for everything. The leading hypothesis, and for the skeptics, I emphasize this is not a theory, this is a hypothesis, has to do with a quantum explanation based in a phenomenon called entanglement, which is a term that the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Erwin Schrödinger advanced in the 1920s. This is how Dean Radin, chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, sees entanglement. Minds are entangled with the universe, so in principle, minds can non-locally influence anything, including a collection of other minds or physical systems. And so if we look at the picture that is beginning to emerge, what is the new story of consciousness that's coming into view? It is one in which consciousness is non-local, by which, among other things, we mean that it is unbounded. And because you can't put it in a box and wall it off from all the other consciousnesses out there, in some dimension, at some level, consciousness come together in unity. And as a consequence of non-local unified minds, you can share wisdom and insight and creativity with other people. You don't have to be the smartest person in the room. If somebody in the room is smart, you can tap into that. There isn't even any room in non-local unbounded awareness. Now, there are some very smart people who have understood the reality of this. This is never acknowledged for the most part. Among them was Thomas Edison, America's great inventor, who said, people say, I've created things. I've never created anything. I get impressions from the universe at large and I work them out, but I'm only a plate on a record or a receiving apparatus, what you will. Thoughts are really impressions that we get from the outside. I think Edison was really a non-local kind of guy. So in this emerging picture of consciousness, isolation is simply a fiction. It's impossible in principle where consciousness is concerned. In this emerging picture, consciousness is communal. And community, therefore, gets back literally to what its etymology is. It's about communion. Community is about communing. And non-locality and entanglement permit that sort of thing. And so we don't have to engineer or invent this unity stuff. It's hardwired. It's factory installed. It's part of our original equipment. It is our birthright. So we only have to wake up to it, not invent it. And there's some deeper implications I want to note. You see, if consciousness is non-local or infinite in space and time, then in some sense it's eternal and immortal. Why immortal? Because temporal non-locality is the very meaning of immortality and eternality. And so this idea then of non-local, infinite, and unbounded consciousness begins to resemble the old horrifying idea of the soul. It's an aspect of who we are that has no beginning, no limit, no end, and is immortal, eternal, and boundless. And so this begins to allow us to resurrect what our ancestors used to refer to as the universal mind, and which the physicist Schrödinger called the one mind. as he expressed it, the overall number of minds is just one. In truth, this Nobel physicist said, in truth, there is only one mind. And if you will hang on to the fall, there is a brilliant book coming out. It is called One Mind, which I happened to write. There are ethical implications of this unitary mind. One which interests me as a physician is that if we're all connected, then there's always a collective global aspect to personal health, so that health is never really personal. If consciousness is unitary and it comes together, then the health of one person affects the health of everybody. And this allows us to rephrase the golden rule from something like this selfish conventional expression, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, to something like this. You better be compassionate to other people because in some sense, they are you. As Bohm said, physicist David Bohm, deep down the consciousness of mankind is one. As Thich Nhat Hanh said, you're me, I am you. Isn't it obvious that we enter are? Nothing we do, however virtuous, can be accomplished alone, the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr said. As Luciano de Crescenzo, the author, said, we are each of us angels with only one wing, and we can only fly by embracing each other. Thank you.